We are so excited to kick off today with Eric Lander. His full bio is exhausting. He has so many honors, but I'm going to give you just the highlights. I want to start by noting that even his fiercest competitors in the industry acknowledge that Eric Lander is an authentic genius. He is president and founding director of the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard. He's a geneticist, a molecular biologist, and a fantastic mathematician. He has played a pioneering role in all aspects of the reading, understanding, and biomedical application of the human genome. He was a principal leader of the Human Genome Project. With his colleagues, Lander has developed and applied powerful methods for discovering the molecular basis of rare genetic diseases, common diseases, and cancer. He has done pioneering work on the human genetic variation. Lander is a professor of biology at MIT and professor of systems biology at Harvard Medical School. He also served as co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology for President Obama. Among the many, many honors that Lander has received, it includes the MacArthur Genius Fellowship and the Breakthrough Prize in the Life Sciences. I know you're going to enjoy this morning's conversation, and if you're interested in hearing more in-depth explorations of some of the topics we're touching on, we're excited to share that we are going to launch a science and policy podcast in 2019 hosted by Eric Lander. In each episode, you'll hear stories and conversations about the most urgent, high-stakes issues that science and society will face in the 21st century. The show will include interviews with scientists, journalists, industry leaders, and others about the hard choices surrounding these issues and how those choices will dramatically shape the future of humanity. And so you'll be able to look forward to that and subscribe to that podcast. And we're really excited to have Eric Lander host that. And just as a side thought on what HubWeek is showing that the future is being built at the intersection of art, science, and technology, and it's being built right here in Boston. Mm-hmm. And Eric Lander is one of the people who is really pioneering that. So it is such a thrill and such an honor. So please welcome Eric Lander.
Okay, so welcome. We're living at a time when the stakes for the future are incredibly high. Science and technology, they hold enormous promise to make America more prosperous and healthier and smarter, and all the world's information at your fingertips, artificial intelligence producing self-driving cars, automatic language translation, world-class pathology, educational technology, dramatic advances in cancer therapy, crops bioengineered, blindingly fast quantum computing, and enormous wealth creation. But of course, it's not that simple. Silicon Valley, for example, promised that with disruptive technologies, they would replace the dusty old models with shiny new models. But lately, folks have begun to wonder whether the motto, move fast and break things, might just leave an awful lot of things in tatters. So it's not a foregone conclusion where science and technology will go and whether it'll deliver on all of those promises. We might not deliver on the promise because we don't invest enough in education and research. We might actually succeed, but the fruits might be delivered so unevenly, putting people out of work and concentrating wealth and political power in a few. We risk our inventions, machine learning, genetic engineering, being turned against us. Deepfakes produced by artificial intelligence, perfect videos of speeches that never happened. Autonomous weapons that must react so quickly there's no room for a human in the loop. Intentional bioweapons, or just inadvertent mistakes with gene drives. The stakes for our future, particularly this country's future, are particularly high because with all this happening, the center of innovation in science and technology may be moving from the United States to China with potentially enormous consequences for our own prosperity and power. So, for that reason, I'm delighted to have two of the most thoughtful people I know who are going to answer everything I just said. I'm looking forward to that. These are two people, two friends, who are both scientists and policy makers, and they both served their country. Maria Zuber is Vice President of Research at MIT. She's also professor of geophysics and an expert in planetary geophysics, what happens on and beneath planets. She's the first woman to lead a science department at MIT and the first woman to lead a NASA planetary mission, which unfortunately I understand doesn't entail actually getting to go visit the planet. But she's actually held leadership roles in 9 NASA missions. She's still an active scientist while doing all of these jobs, including writing papers recently on everything from gravitational signatures of impact craters to using DNA sequencing to look for life on Mars. But of special note to this discussion today, she plays a national role as well. She serves as the chair of the National Science Board, which oversees the U.S. National Science Foundation, the country's leading supporter of fundamental research and education outside of biomedicine, and she was appointed to that role by President Obama. So in her roles both at MIT and in Washington, she thinks deeply about science, technology, and the future of America. We've also got Ash Carter. Ash served as the 25th Secretary of Defense for the United States from 2015 to 2017 under President Barack Obama. This was the capstone to 3 decades of service to the United States under multiple presidents of both parties. Ash has a somewhat unusual academic background for a Secretary of Defense. He got his bachelor's degree at Yale with a joint program in physics and medieval history. His PhD was in theoretical physics when he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. We actually overlapped a little bit, working on quantum field theory. And he did many, many important things as Secretary of Defense, but I want to mention 2. First, he directed that for the first time, all military positions without exception would be open to women, and directed that transgender individuals would be welcome to join and serve openly in the military. Second, and very relevant to this morning, he drove innovation at the Pentagon. He created the Defense Digital Service that brought technology experts into the Pentagon for tours of duty, opened Pentagon outposts in Silicon Valley, here in Boston and in Austin and other tech hubs, and he established the department's first Defense Innovation Board, on which I've had the privilege to serve. So I hope you will join me in welcoming to the stage here Maria Zuber and Ash Carter. So we got a lot to talk about, and a lot of it is going to be worries. And I think scientists and technologists have an obligation to worry because we understand things and we know things could go wrong, and the only way to guarantee or at least hope to increase the probability that things will go right is by worrying hard about the ways it could go wrong and trying to keep it on the track. But before we turn to all the worries, I just want to ask the two of you, what excites you right now about the future of science and technology over the next, 30 years or so to mid-century? Maria, you're at MIT, you see everything around you. What excites you now?
Well, lots and lots of things. If I had to generalize it, I would say looking at the ability of scientific discoveries to improve lives. Okay, and I mean that in the most general possible sense. Everything from health and wellness to just the excitement brought by discoveries, knowing our place in the universe, the whole range of human experiences that people can live a better, more informed life. And so the discoveries, the whole suite of discoveries that are occurring, from health to energy to astrophysics is remarkable, and the young people going into these fields really can't be stopped. And so what I'm excited about is that the young people that we're seeing today, they've grown up with a sense of service. Okay, they've started doing community service when they're in middle school or maybe even before that, and many of them just stick with it. And so even those people going into a science or technology field because they love science or technology have it in their minds that they want to leave the world a better place than the one that they came into. And so I say, we can get into specifics as we go along, but that's what excites me.
So Ash,
Very similar. One theme of technology that Boston particularly is strong at is the integration of digital, bio, and things like jobs and training. There are other places that are strong in individual parts of that. Only Boston has it all. And that's where the future is. And that's why when I walked out the Pentagon a year and 3/4 ago, after first walking in 38 years ago, and had to decide what I was going to do next, I wanted to be around ideas and young people, and I wanted to be in a place that put it all together, and also to get to the point both of you made, that has an ethos, an understanding of right and wrong that isn't everywhere in the world of technology. And so I came to Boston, and apropos of something Maria said about this generation, Eric, and you've seen this too. When I started out, I was a young physicist, no intention of doing anything in public life at all, but the generation that trained me were the Manhattan Project people in my field. And they had done something disruptive, to put it mildly. Namely, they had invented the bomb. They were proud of that because they believed it had ended World War II and kept the world peaceful for another 50 years. But they also knew that there was a downside to it, per what you both said, and that they had a responsibility to that side of things too. So they're the same people who did the bomb invented arms control, non-proliferation, missile defense, civil defense, some things we don't do anymore, but it was all well intended from all over the political spectrum. And they taught me that with knowledge comes responsibility. And that's how I got into this business in the first place. The generation that came after that wasn't that did much of what we see around us today, didn't feel, to my eyes, as much a part of society, more interested in doing what they're doing. That's come back, and you see it in the students here. They want to do things of consequence, sure, but they want to do things that are consequential in a good way, and that is terrific. And that, if you say, what's the good news? That gives me heart, because technology is unstoppable. And there's a lot of stuff that's going on exciting. We'll talk about it all here today, but we bend the arc of that change, and we need to bend it towards the overall direction of human good, and that is happening here in Boston. That's why I think we are the best technology hub in America, hands down.
Well, that's great. All right, so I share your excitement, particularly about this next generation and their sense of responsibility. And boy, they have a lot to be responsible about, given what's going on. I don't know where to start, but I'm going to start with, I rattled off a list of all these amazing things that could happen. Artificial intelligence with self-driving cars, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of questions about who's going to benefit from that. In Boston, we're a magnet. This is a tech hub for tech, biotech, so many different things, but that's not distributed uniformly across the country. The benefits of technology economically aren't distributed uniformly across people. What do you guys think about the prosperity that comes out of this? Is it going to be an inclusive prosperity or a lopsided prosperity? And what do we have to do to make sure it's inclusive?
Okay, so I'll start.
Sure.
No,
Dive right
right
in.
ahead.
There are no easy questions actually on the list, so feel free. Yeah.
So, okay, so I think these new discoveries must be inclusive and must benefit everybody. Okay, so at MIT, we like to think that the discoveries that we make are helping people, and we think, I mean, it's part of our core values that we want to help people, and so when we hear things like AI is going to remove everybody's jobs, and that worries us greatly.
So what are we doing about that?
At our university, we have actually started a project called not the future of work, but work of the future. Okay, so we are of the opinion, which I think is shared by many. Ash can give his opinion on this, that these new emerging technologies are going to create even more jobs than there are now. But we have to make sure that the people who are displaced from jobs go into these new jobs. So, for example, let me give you an interesting statistic. Okay, there are now in this country 800,000 jobs in clean energy. Okay, at the peak of coal mining in the United States in the 1920s, the number of jobs in coal mining was about 800,000. Okay. Now there are 50,000 coal mining jobs. You can bet that most of those clean energy jobs have not gone to coal miners who have been displaced from coal mining. So there's a clean energy revolution going on. It must go on, and we'll talk more about that as we move on here. But we need to think about how people displaced from various industries can be incorporated into the new economy. And what it comes down to, it's education, and it's not just education, it is lifelong learning. Okay, so all of us, obviously those of us at universities, but also those of us in business and industry need to be looking at the workforces that we have and continually training those workforces for the next job that's going to happen. And we have to make education accessible, not just to people in Boston, where we are blessed that we have many great universities, but we have to make sure that we have the ability to put education out there that anybody can access. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that's key, and we could explore those themes more.
So Ash, you've talked a lot about this as well, and I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with Maria, and I just amend it slightly, and I'm sure she meant this also. Yeah. It can create more jobs than it destroys. And a little thing to think about is the farm-to-factory movement of 150 years ago. Think about that. Start out, and you got 80% of the population living on farms. You end up, you got 80% living in cities. A huge disruption that worked out pretty well here, but it looks rosy now in retrospect, but it was pretty rocky. And in some places it failed utterly, like Russia. Mm-hmm. And so it's not automatic. And I think the thing to keep in mind is we have to always innovate to create the things that go along with making the rest of innovation positive. So I have a little game I play with the many people around here are working on driverless cars. And I say that, it's really interesting and that's cool and so forth. Can you save a little of your mind share for the carless driver?
Yeah.
What about the person who gets left behind? Because we can't have a cohesive society if a lot of people don't see a path ahead for them and their children. And I want to live in a cohesive society, and that's an important value to me.
Whose responsibility is this going to be? I mean, startups that are doing this kind of disruption are not going to say it's their responsibility to go figure out what to do with the workers they've displaced. Universities, government, how's it going to happen? Where's the creative energy and the fuel to make sure that that's happening? Because as you say, it's not a theorem that there have to be more jobs created than are destroyed. It's been a fact over the last century.
I don't believe that they don't feel that way. Many employers do.
Okay.
And so let's suppose you're in, I happen to know, Rochester, New York. Big company in Rochester, New York. Your workers are not going to, we think of young people as being highly mobile. Mm-hmm. They're not. They're mobile once. Mm-hmm. Then they settle in, they have a family, and they're not mobile anymore. So in Rochester, it's going to be the people who live there who are going to populate that business. If it's going to prosper, that company has a stake in making sure that that place hangs together and that kids get an education that qualify them for work there. And Maria, I just can't foot stomp enough what she said about lifelong learning. One of the things I love about being here and being at a university, every day is a feast of knowledge, but that's life. The day when you get your education until you're 21, or maybe 18, and then you coast on that for the next 60 years, those days are over.
All right, so we've got one set of issues there. Let me now take it very global. This past century, the United States was tremendously prosperous, in no small part because we were the world's leader in science and technology. After World War II, there was no peer. There wasn't even a close, near peer to the United States. And it resulted in lots of science, lots of Nobel Prizes, creation of whole new intellectual fields, but also whole new industries. The internet, global positioning systems, GPSs, biotechnology. So we reaped a tremendous amount from being the center of science and technology. It's not clear that's going to continue. We have some really serious competition. Since the beginning of this century, China has been increasing its annual investment in R&D by something like 18% a year. We've been running at 4%. And the lines of how much of the world's R&D are getting done in the US, which had us far ahead of everybody, those lines are going to cross within the next 2 years, where China is actually doing more, at least on a per dollar basis, of the world's R&D. And you can quibble about quality of this or that, but there's no doubt where this is going. When you look at the top 20 tech companies in the world, 11 are in the United States and 9 are in China. When you look at artificial intelligence, the deep learning revolution in AI came from Canada and the US, but China has just run with it in a ferocious way. Some people have said that Google's AlphaGo program, playing this distinctively Asian game here, was the Sputnik moment for China, and it led to massive investments. The city of Tianjin alone is going to be investing $16 billion in AI funding. These are just stunning things, and China's declared they want to be the leader by 2025 in applied AI, and recently now in basic research. It's not just limited to AI, it's quantum computing, it's other things. So does this matter? Is it important to this century where the US stands relative to China? And if it is, what do we have to do? Is it fine that innovation is happening at a greater rate there? Are there consequences to that? Not a small question, but either of you can just jump in on it.
You want to start?
Ash, you want to take
Okay.
China?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Eric, you're right. You can't expect to live in the world of post-World War II, where we had all the money and all the technology forever. But that doesn't mean you lose your way, or that you have to forget what you stand for and what you do. So when I started out, as I said, when I started out in this business, everything of consequence came from the United States. And by the way, much of that came from the government, and the NSF, or NIH, or the
Pentagon.
DOD.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was there. I remember we did the internet, we did GPS. These things were important. You can't expect that anymore. The technology base is going to be global, and it's going to be commercial, which means if you're interested in public life, you need to figure out how to get public life into that mix. It's not going to be bought by the public for that purpose any longer. That's a different style, and that's the reason I created those outposts in the Pentagon. We couldn't afford to be a ghetto and to be competitive in the world, and we need to be competitive because we need to be able to, put too fine a point on it, destroy our enemies. But we take our values to the battlefield. And I make no apologies about that. And that's important as well, because apropos of China, I have a lot of Chinese friends. I've been going back and forth for a long time, and I'm for engaging with China, and inevitably we will trade with China, but it's a communist dictatorship. And it is what it is. We are not, and I'm glad we're not. And that is a difference we're not going to resolve by war or even Cold War. But you have to remember where your head is on that. And yes, they lead in AI, but I don't want the kind of AI that creates perfect repressive surveillance, which is actually an objective, quite openly, of the Chinese. That's not the kind of society I wish to live in. And, you know, when we had the Cold War, we had an opponent who had a different lifestyle with whom we disagreed, but we didn't trade with the Soviet Union. We built an impermeable wall. I don't think we can do that with China. We do have to play defense to some extent, because they can bring to bear military, economic, and political force in a way that a society like ours can't. They can bring it to bear on our companies, and they can bring it to bear on our universities, and they can bring it to bear on our friends around the world. And that's a competitive disadvantage, inherently so. And we need to do so. There are things we need to do about that. But above all, and this is just to get to what both of you have said, you got to play offense. You just can't play defense in this world. We've got to up our own game.
Yeah, so how's our game going? I mean, you chair the National Science Board. You think a lot about this at MIT. What are we doing or not doing that's going to be able to maximize the position of this country in this century?
So let me just start by saying, you know, every country on Earth practically has read our playbook.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we published the playbook. Yeah.
And so they look to us, and they aspire to have the quality of life that we have. They aspire to be prosperous like we are, and they know that investment in science and technology, which has led to job growth and discovery, is kind of what has gotten us where we are today. So the United States share of the pie is necessarily going to decrease just because the whole world is getting in the game. That's not all bad, because we can learn from them too. So we, our president, Raphael Reif, likes to say, China's not going to steal 5G away from us because we don't have it, right? The three biggest telecom companies that are investing in that technology is, Nokia, Ericsson, and Huawei.
Yeah.
Sweden, Finland, and China. Okay,
Yeah.
and Huawei in China is investing 2.5 times what the others are investing in it, and we're not making those investments for reasons that Ash said. It's a concern to me that we're going to be dependent on China for 5G, and I there's a lot of discussion
That's an economic
going on
concern
about
and a
that.
security concern.
Both of those.
Yeah.
Right. So, however, China's making huge investments. They have the most people. In supercomputers, we've now overtaken China again in having the fastest supercomputer. But, if you look at all the fastest computers, China has over 200 of the top 500, and we have less than 150 of the fastest computers. So they are investing more in computing. In the AI area, they have announced that they will invest 100 times more than the United States has invested.
So 100 times sounds consequential.
In over the last 5 years. 100 times is consequential.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of engineers over there, because of the population to do this work. So we have to invest.
Okay, so who's we and how's this going to happen? Is this the government needs to do things it's not doing? Industry, and how can we help them?
Well, our 4% a year of increase it has virtually all been from the private sector because federal funding.
That's a total R&D.
That's right. That's industry and government.
Yep.
So the government has been flat to declining, and industry has been growing, but industry funds what it needs to have to do its thing. Okay, and that leaves basic research for the government to fund. And of course, basic research is when you don't know what you're necessarily going to get. You might have some idea of where you want to get to or what you would like to have, but discovery sometimes leads you in interesting directions that are unanticipated, and that's part of the beauty of that. And the basic research is essentially it's the seed corn. I mean, it is the base of knowledge that is then used to advance technology. So quantum mechanics. I mean, we needed quantum mechanics for GPS. We needed quantum mechanics for iPhones. We're going to need quantum mechanics for the next generation of the fastest computers. But no one had any of that in mind when scientists first started studying quantum mechanics. So the government's role is primarily in the basic research area, but government, industry, private individuals and foundations, these partnerships is really really the future, I think.
I mean, do you get the sense that the government is currently laser focused on this issue?
There's talk. There's talk about it, and actually the federal budget has been better.
A little better, yeah.
A little better.
It's good for biomedical research,
right.
actually. It's gotten some increases, but
it's been a little better across the board in the last year and a half. But we're at risk because it's part of the discretionary budget. So at some point, our elected representatives are going to realize that deficits are not a good idea, and when that happens, basic science funding is at great risk, I would say. And for where we need to be in the future, we need to be increasing not a few percent a year. We need to be investing massively. And if you don't mind, I'd like to use this opportunity to make a plug for immigration, because we have done well in this country by attracting the best and the brightest students from everywhere in the world to come to the United States, and then they get educated, and most of them stay. So even now, over the last 5 years, 85% of Chinese students who have come to the U.S. have actually stayed in the U.S. Those who have declared a desire to have stayed in the U.S. So most have stayed. And China, with a larger population and a bigger economy, we have, if we want to keep competing with that, we have got to attract the best students from all over the world.
Right.
So the answer is not to put blockades up. The answer is to welcome the best and the brightest.
No, it's been a secret asset of the United States that we can draw from all over the world, and people still do want to be here. If we were to lose that, that would be a pretty serious risk, I would think. I don't know, Ash, do you have thoughts about our investment?
We're not spending enough. It's not even close. And things do get a little bit better, mostly because gridlock is over, because you have a single party in control of both the White House and both houses of Congress. All the time I was in the number 1, the number 2, or the number 3 in the Department of Defense over the last decade, we didn't get a budget.
Yeah.
We never got a defense budget. And always, I would say, I believe I need the budget I've asked for. I believe that's necessary to protect our people and make it a better world, but I don't want it at the expense of everything else. Because people love to do that, say, let's up the defense budget and cut everything else. And this discretionary budget, if you're not a budgeteer, that is really important. Most people think that the federal budget is made up of things like National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy. Not true. Most of the federal budget is made up of Medicare, other social safety net, interest on the debt, and over here is the tax breaks also, which cost money. And over here is the discretionary budget, which is half defense and half non-defense. That leaves for that non-defense part, to me, an unconscionably small sliver. Now, we still have strong industry, which invests. We have state and local governments that invest. So it's a complex picture. And by the way, if I can just note, add to United States and China, Europe, India, it's a multi-polar, and you talked about immigrants. If a very large, tell Prime Minister Modi this, I said, I don't know why this is the case, but if you look at American startups, a very high fraction of them are founded by either Indians or Indian Americans.
Yep.
There's something going on there, which is pretty impressive. And about immigrants, immigrants make very good service members. I'll just tell you that, and you don't take that for granted.
All right, let me take you guys in another direction completely. I want to go back to disruption. I have this long list of disruptive technologies, and I'd love it if you would, together with me, prognosticate about where this is going. Social media, that enables commerce, wonderful thing, and it also amplifies craziness.
Yep.
It amplifies propaganda. We got bots, we got trolls. You can buy likes for things right now. We're worried about whether you can buy votes in some way. We have unverified identities out there. What to do about this? Congress held hearings on these questions. Mark Zuckerberg came down and talked. What's the fix?
Let's just start with Mark Zuckerberg did come, and I commend him for coming and the Congress for convening it. But let's be realistic. The hearing was a bust. It didn't go anywhere. Everybody knows that we need to do something about this because we've got hate, we've got lying, we've got bullying, we've got all kinds of stuff going on that's not okay. But you've got commerce and community and chance to be with families. There's a lot of wonderful stuff too. So how to have the good and not just the bad. So there was an opportunity that could have been a moment in history, and we've all seen moments in history like that, where a solution came into view. And a hearing's a good place to do that, but it didn't. I don't think his performance, it got through the news cycle, but isn't going to get through history, I don't think, the accounting of behavior of his company. And I thought the Congress was embarrassingly ill-prepared. I've been joking to people that I wish they had been that ill-prepared to question me about war and peace when I was Secretary of Defense.
You'd
And
had
so,
an easier
so,
time,
So the
yeah.
whole thing was a flop. But what would have been good was if they both agreed, if you read the subtext, that some mixture of regulation and self-regulation is needed. That's the common ground. Now all we need to do is decide what the mix is there. Is it this, what's in each pot? And that could have been a hugely fertile moment. I hope we get that back. Because as you say, Eric, we do need to do something about this. And Maria's students are very active in this area at MIT.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I mean, the fundamental business model there is people access all these platforms for free, but you give away
Not free.
your personal information, right?
Like
So
I say, if it's free, you're the product.
that's
You're not the
So
customer, you're the product.
That's exactly
Remember
right.
that.
So that's another part of the problem that has to be solved. Now, I mean, there is precedent for a solution. I mean, we had Napster, which people downloaded music illegally, and artists did not get the benefit of the royalties on the music that they created. And but a fix came into be, iTunes. Okay, so a fix happened. It's possible, but people have to realize that there's a cost to it, and people have to be willing to bear the cost.
So is MIT thinking about this? I mean, full disclosure, I'm at MIT and
Yeah.
Harvard both. So,
Me too.
But are there projects right now to think about a new kind of way of organizing
there-
this, a new internet for this?
Well, there certainly are programs, and this is what's key here is really bringing in the humanists and the social sciences as part of the discussion at the beginning, as the discoveries are taking place, so that because the discoveries are going to happen. Technology, the horses are out of the barn. We're not going to say, we're not going to develop the new technology. We're not going to develop the new AI. These things are going to happen, and in the social media, the humanists and the social weren't there at the beginning thinking about these consequences because nobody anticipated this, but we've been burned, and so for us, drawing in our social science communities and our humanists to help. I mean, our computer science and artificial intelligence laboratory, the faculty, have come. They're asking to sit down and have discussions on ethics. You're doing this over at the Belfer Center, where, inviting Harvard, MIT, and beyond to sit down and talk about these issues at the get-go, and to nudge everything in a very productive direction.
And good you are. Let me push it even a bit further. Let's take artificial intelligence and the civilian uses of it. I mentioned briefly deepfakes. So what's that? That's the idea that you can write an AI system that could take a photograph and turn it into the Monet version, as Monet would have painted that photograph, or vice versa, or it is some Japanese floating world version of that. Well, that same technology, these cyclic adversarial networks there, they could be used to take a speech that I give and turn it into a speech that you give, for example, and do it pretty seamlessly. In short, seeing, hearing isn't going to be believing anymore. There's just enormous opportunities to erode trust when I can't even believe the things that I used to believe. Similarly, privacy. So we've got a certain set of questions. There's privacy, online, of course, but there's privacy, as you were referring to, Ash, in China. There's fantastic facial recognition, which means that as cameras are distributed, we know where you are at all times. In principle, you could do that here too. These questions of the uses of AI that could erode trust, could erode privacy, could create surveillance, how are we on top of this?
well, it's all hands on deck, right?
Yeah.
So for sure, there's a high sensitivity level to it, and our researchers are all over it. Okay, we're not doing enough. So I mean, one thing that I will say is, when we review the cases of people coming up for tenure, okay, at MIT, so it's you're still relatively, emerging researcher, who's accomplished. So virtually every tenure case at MIT last year, the researchers in every field were using some aspect of artificial intelligence or machine learning in their research.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So it's everywhere in all areas of endeavor, okay, in science and technology, if MIT is representative of where the field's going. So it's not something that can or it should be limited to computer science. It's everywhere, and all I can say is constant vigilance, and we need more.
Eric, I agree with Maria. We're not on top of it, but I do believe we can get on top of it.
Yeah.
We have to get on top of it. Now, what would on top of it mean? To me, the key to AI, and there are a lot of different words that go. This is true of big data systems as well, and all the other words that are kind of related to the same thing. I think that transparency and human accountability are critical. And let me give you an example, which I know you're going to ask me about later, so I might as well preempt it. People ask me all the time about autonomous weapons.
That's coming up, actually.
And I might as well get to it because it's the same thing here,
okay.
which is I issued a directive that said there would not be defense systems capable of lethal action for which a human was not in the decision. Now, that doesn't have to be in the loop in the sense of bit by bit by bit, but you have to take responsibility for it. And I put myself in the following situation. If I went out the next morning after we conducted a raid, which we do all the time, we have to do, and that killed women and children, and I said the machine did it, you'd crucify me, and you should. Because it's my responsibility, it's our responsibility. You have to have a human being responsible for this stuff. And that is actually a design criterion for AI. You have to, I think, to sell in an ethical way an AI system, you have to be able to know how to unfold decisions so that you can explain how they occurred. Because I think we human beings ultimately need to be responsible for, they can be aided by, but not entirely substituted by machines.
Help me out on that, because the principles of deep learning that underlie AI are you take a huge pile of data, you pour it through a neural network, it tweaks its coefficients so that it gets the right answers often enough, and you have no idea how it might perform on data that are out of your training set. You have no idea what the principles are that it's using because it's optimized all its little coefficients to perform well. So if people do that, I like what you're saying about that responsibility, but we can't even take responsibility for
I've been managing
simpler
technology
systems.
projects, Eric, for 50 years, and engineers always tell you that they can't do one thing or another. And I learned in systems, you say, oh yes, you can. You have to put it on the list of key ingredients. So there has to be a measure of that. Now, that can be gotten in lots of different ways, not by necessarily peeling back the leaves of a deep network, if you know how they work, but by other forms of testing, peer review. An example, flight hardware on aircraft is tested. So a Boeing aircraft or something, if you change a flight system, there's a group of people who know that technology who idiot-proof it. Not not perfectly, but give it a look and make sure that it's okay. And so that's what we're asking for. I think it's required. I think we're all going to require that of if a decision's made of consequence to us. You're going to want to know, hey, wait a minute, why me? How did I get picked out? I knew a guy who got on the no-fly list once for TA. His name was John White. So how many John Whites are there? And he was on the no-fly list, and it was a devil to get off the damn thing because they couldn't figure out why he got on. You can't have people in that kind of. So I think I think you have to look at it as a technical challenge that goes with getting all the wonders of AI in a way that is humanly accountable. So you make it a design criteria.
And let me jump on the pile and agree with that, because we have the same situation when we send anything to outer space. You can't get in there, so you just test it and test it and test it in every conceivable way that you can test it, and most things work pretty well, or the ones that I've been involved with from NASA. Not always, but.
So you got to have intense testing of these AI systems. So can I mention an AI system that is a little different, but it also has very important consequences to life. There are systems for sentencing defendants or for contributing to the sentencing of defendants, a system called Compass. And in the state of Wisconsin, I think a prisoner who was sentenced with input from this machine learning program sued to say, this can't be used because it's a proprietary system. Nobody has access to it. You can't see its performance. And the Supreme Court of Wisconsin said, nah, it's not a problem because it wasn't the only input to the judge's decision. So we may not be completely succeeding on this testing and understanding how things are working. I don't know if you have any reaction to how broadly we're going to have to apply this rule of a transparency of what's going on in systems that either fire weapons that could kill people or recommend putting away people for 20 years.
It's a perfect case, if I may say. I'm familiar with it. And it was a system that had flaws. There's a little bit of garbage in, garbage out. That is, the big data that went in was itself had some bias in it.
Yeah.
And then the algorithm amplified the bias. It didn't take the bias out. It wasn't really objective. It amplified. Now, it didn't have to be that way, but that's the way it was. So it got answers for people predictably based upon their color, among other things.
Yep.
That didn't match the underlying fact of a particular case. So you got to be very suspicious of these things. They can aid human decision making, but they can't take away responsibility. We're responsible. If we put somebody in jail, we as society, doggone it, the machine can't do it. We have to do it.
So I have a list of other things I'd love to get to, but I want to make sure we get to questions from the audience. But things that I might ask about are about climate change, since you're in charge of planets. This is a good planet too, and I'd be curious about that. And
I prefer ours.
Biological weapons and many other things, editing nature. But I'm going to turn to the audience now and see if we have some questions for the last 12 or 15 minutes. Great. If you'll go around and find folks. And if you run out of questions, I still have lots more I'd love to ask these folks.
Hello. I guess I have two questions, both related to China, one for each panelist. Secretary Carter, you mentioned that China model of surveillance is not, feasible or logical for U.S. But at the same time, there's this truth about the strength of the surveillance for security, right? So you look at, for instance, Boston Marathon bombers, and tragic event happened. Our ability to detect those terrorists was purely based on our ability to use vision technologies that depend on deep learning and the scale of that technology. So how do we differentiate U.S. model of surveillance if we are not about scaling or being more aggressive? Is my question for you. And in regards to diversity, in education and innovation. I'd like to ask Maria is about the Chinese model. I mean, Chinese innovation is very strong. I mean, I'm in the STEM field. I see a lot of publications, coming out of the Chinese. I mean, substantially, they are outperforming anybody else in terms of numbers of publications, I think, in STEM education. So if MIT's or U.S. education system is interested in recruiting more immigrants around the world, should that also include the Chinese scholars to bring them here, perhaps as part of MIT system and education and as policy? Thank you.
First one's a great question, and if I can rephrase it a little bit, in counterterrorism, there is a balance that needs to be struck between freedom and justice and effective. You have to protect yourself against barbarism. Society can't live with these guys running around, ISIS guys, and so they had to go. That's part of a decent society as well. So there is that balance, and that balance exists in China as well. But you have to be clear about what your values are. We are a society that definitely values those other things, and there's some lengths that we don't go to. I was not allowed by law, by the President of the United States, but also by my own beliefs, to do certain things that, taken to their extreme, would have been effective. I had to find another way to protect our people. And is that a little harder? Yeah, but it's worth it, because so there are shortcuts. You can always take moral shortcuts, and technology is an invitation to moral shortcuts. But I think the panel's been saying that the technology community, because they understand the technology needs to be in the game of making sure that the applications are morally, it's not going to happen without them, because their knowledge, as we saw from the Congress, they need
folk who know what's going on.
Yeah, so what I say to technology is get in the game, help this out, make it better, make it a little piece of your life.
Yeah, and I'll to answer the second question. So the short answer is yes, we should be welcoming Chinese students to the U.S. and then enticing them to stay, or enticing the best ones to stay, at least. So I mean, one of the things that I said is, when we hand somebody from an international student a PhD, we ought to hand them a green card. As well, and encourage them to stay here, and to get to the point that you made at the beginning of your question about just the number of publications, it is true that the amount of scholarship that's coming out of China is increasing greatly. It's also important to take into account not just quantity but also quality, and so in the U.S., what really has been the bedrock of scientific discovery has been peer review, rigorous review of information, which means when you write a scientific paper, there ought to be enough detail in that paper for somebody else to go and reproduce the analysis. So reproducibility has been an issue with some of the Chinese work because they don't release all of their data. They keep it proprietary. So unless scientific discoveries can be fully assessed with all the information out there, just the number of publications out there, you don't know what the quality that's being produced. But China wants to be a world player in this regard. So that tide is starting to turn. So.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Got a couple right here.
I know a lot of folks are very concerned about autonomous weapons, and some people have compared them, to our generation's version of nuclear weapons. Secretary Carter, I know that you've said that what's actually potentially more comparable is biological weapons. And I know that the DoD has been investing in research and development and sort of learning more about gene drives. And so I'm curious, what are some of the safeguards that need to be put in place in order to ensure that that technology is developed, in the safest way possible, in a way that doesn't, lead to destruction?
Huge, but you want to ask Eric Lander that question. It's a huge question, and there are answers to it. There have to be answers to it, but he knows them.
Well,
or get them.
I know a bit about it because the Broad Institute that I direct is very actively involved in CRISPR research and has patents in CRISPR research, including some of the technologies that would underlie the use of gene drives. I'll just note that when we've thought about licensing those patents, we've explicitly excluded, and this is of course joint with MIT and in some cases with Harvard as well, we've explicitly excluded the licensing of gene drives from any of those licenses right now, because we feel like while there got to be answers, there aren't answers yet, and we ought to give society some time to get answers before it's out there. So it was an interesting exercise to use patents as a way to preserve some space for society to sort this out. Because I agree, there are compelling cases. Malaria. I want to kill the mosquitoes that are vectors of malaria. I wouldn't miss them. I'm not sure that the ecosystem wouldn't miss them, and we got to understand that. But the case is kind of compelling. But then you could say the same thing about every invasive species, the carp in the Great Lakes, the others, and it's pretty clear we don't understand what the consequences would be. So it's an interesting and complicated question, and I think right now buying the time by saying we do not have to move till we know what we're doing would be a refreshing approach. So.
Can I just be clear?
Yeah.
We do not, should not, and I would oppose developing and fielding biological weapons by the United States. We stopped doing that decades ago, and darned if I want to see us start. We do research in order to protect ourselves, and others do the same kind of research. And there are countries that have biological, make no mistake, the North Koreans have them, the Russians have them, and so on. We don't, and that is okay with me. In fact, it is correct as far as I'm concerned.
Hello?
Yep, working now.
Hi, I'm Justin Bax. I think you both did a really elegant job really talking about the dangers of AI and the need for education. And when I think about this issue and I think about the business leaders, I think about our political leaders, I think part of this issue is this educational disconnect. You have PhDs that have spent their whole lives studying artificial intelligence, studying the coding and creating it. And I think there's this disconnect between senior leaders that are making strategic decisions and developers. And I'm wondering how you see that gap, really changing over time. Is it technology that's going to bridge that gap? Like I think we have a communication issue that's creating this. And so I'd be interested in your comments around this communication issue and where you see it going 5, 10, 20 years down the road. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it would obviously raising the conversation and having discussions like this openly is going to be absolutely crucial in this regard. I think the government potentially has a role to play in this, in terms of providing guardrails, that just some things we're just not going to do and we just shouldn't do, and that to me is less preferable but necessary. But I think open discussion about risks is going to be crucial, because one of the things that I talk with all my students about, the kind of students that I get, they can do anything. They think they can do anything, but should you? There are a lot of problems that could be done, but should they be done? Okay, and so in the education process, having those discussions of what you should do versus what you can do, I think is going to be essential.
That's beautifully said. I won't add to it. Get another question that can't improve.
Great. We have, sadly, just a couple of seconds left. We're supposed to wrap up. I just want to observe, these folks are amazing. They are, and I am, wildly pro-science. We are scientists. We believe in science and technology. But I think what's wonderful about this discussion is to understand that to be pro-science is also to appreciate the responsibilities that come with being a scientist. It isn't just about the technology, it's about values. To understand where fast-moving things can run takes people who have a pretty good idea of the first derivative and the second derivative of how it's changing, or even have a clue what a derivative is in that regard. So it's refreshing to have this kind of conversation. And Boston is a magnet for science and technology. It brings together, I mean, no place in the known universe has a concentration of people across such diverse scientific communities, such educational institutions. But what I also love about it is it's a place also that is not afraid to discuss values, because it doesn't mean that we want to be Luddites. It means we want to be proud of what comes of this. And so I would love to see, over the course of the next year, more and more conversation growing out of today's HubWeek discussion about what does it mean to be responsible, so that 10, 20, 30 years from now, our children and our grandchildren will be proud of what's come of all this. And no better place to do it than here. I want to thank the Boston Globe and Linda Henry and everybody who organized this, and these two friends for coming out on a rainy morning to talk, and all of you for being part of this conversation. It's just the start to what I hope will be a rich one. Thank you all very much for coming.
We're with you as always.